When you hear that a nation as vast and as historically complex as India has cut off trade with a superpower like America, the temptation is to see it as a single dramatic move, an emotional reaction. Perhaps to a disagreement or a particular incident, but human beings, and by extension the nations they form, do not operate on such simple, surface-level motivations. They are layered, historical entities. Every political decision is shaped by decades, sometimes centuries of accumulated memory, perceived injustices, and ideological commitments. This is why we must resist the urge to interpret such events purely in terms of this week's headlines. That approach is akin to reading one page of a 1,000-page novel and pretending you understand the plot. To know the truth, you have to trace the threads back into the past. You have to understand the psychological architecture of nations, the values they are built upon, and the traumas they carry. Imagine, for a moment, the way an individual responds to betrayal. It rarely happens in isolation. Often, the betrayal is the final straw after years of small, unresolved conflicts, minor grievances that accumulate until they form a structure of resentment. Nations are no different. What we call trade disagreements are often just the visible portion of a much larger iceberg of historical mistrust. India's relationship with America has been punctuated by both collaboration and tension, shaped by differences in political philosophy, economic priorities, and cultural autonomy. And when these differences remain unaddressed, they slowly become embedded into policy making. That's how nations, much like individuals, find themselves making decisions that seem abrupt, but are actually the inevitable result of a long process of erosion. Part of the problem is that our modern news culture thrives on immediacy. We are presented with simplified cause and effect narratives because complexity is uncomfortable and time-consuming to explain. But if you want to understand why India took such a decisive economic stance, you have to be willing to wade into that complexity. You must examine historical trade imbalances, disputes over intellectual property rights, and the shifting power dynamics in the global economic order. You must acknowledge the legacy of colonialism, which left India with a deep-seated sensitivity to any arrangement that might be perceived as exploitative. All of these factors are not just numbers on a balance sheet, they are part of the narrative identity of a nation, influencing how its leaders perceive both threats and opportunities. In psychological terms, nations operate much like personalities. They have core values, defensive mechanisms, and visions for the future. When another nation's actions, or even its attitudes, are perceived as violating those values, the defensive mechanisms activate. This can manifest as trade restrictions, diplomatic pushback, or complete disengagement. For India, the balance between cooperation and self-protection has always been a delicate one. It is a country that prizes its sovereignty deeply, partly because it was denied for so long under colonial rule. That historical experience has conditioned it to be acutely aware of any economic dependency that might threaten its self-determination. Even the perception of such a threat can tip the scales towards a more isolationist stance. The truth is, trade relationships are not purely transactional. They are relational. They require trust, reciprocity, and a shared understanding of long-term goals. When those elements break down, what follows is not merely a shift in policy, but a redefinition of the relationship itself. For India, disengaging from America economically would not have been a decision made lightly, because the costs, both immediate and strategic, are significant. Yet, if the relationship had already deteriorated to the point where trust was fractured, continuing it might have been seen as more dangerous than ending it. In such a scenario, the severing of ties becomes not an act of aggression, but one of self-preservation, rooted in the belief that the relationship has strayed too far from mutual benefit. We also have to consider the symbolic dimension of such a move. Nations, like individuals, communicate through action as much as through words. Ending trade with America would send a message not only to Washington, but to the entire global community. It would signal a willingness to endure economic turbulence in order to assert a principle. This symbolic layer is often underestimated in economic analysis, but it is critical in understanding international politics. It's not just about goods, services, and tariff. It's about narrative control. India's leadership might have calculated that the story of a nation standing firm against what it perceives as overreach would resonate both domestically and internationally. Another factor is the shifting global context in which this decision occurs. The world is moving away from a unipolar system dominated by a single superpower and towards a multipolar reality where emerging nations have greater influence. In such an environment, strategic alliances become more fluid, and the willingness to pivot away from traditional partners is greater. India, with its growing economic power and strategic importance, is in a position to explore alternative trade relationships with other nations or blocs. This reduces its dependence on any one partner, particularly one with whom tensions have been rising. The decision to end trade with America, therefore, could be seen as a recalibration in response to a changing world order. It's important to remember that from a leadership perspective, such decisions are often framed not as acts of hostility, but as necessary steps in pursuing a larger vision. Leaders must weigh not only the current state of affairs, but also the trajectory they believe their nation must follow. This means evaluating whether existing trade relationships support or hinder that trajectory. If the conclusion is that the relationship is obstructive, then ending it becomes part of a broader strategic plan. In this sense, the move is not just reactive, it is proactive, aimed at shaping the future rather than merely enduring the present. This perspective can be hard to grasp when we are trained to think in terms of short-term cause and effect. From the outside, it can appear that such a move is irrational or excessively risky. Critics might argue that cutting trade ties with a nation as economically powerful as America is a self-inflicted wound. But this assumes that material prosperity is the sole metric of national well-being. For a country like India, other considerations, cultural autonomy, geopolitical positioning, and moral narrative, can weigh just as heavily. In fact, prioritizing these non-material values over immediate economic gain can strengthen a nation's resilience in the long run. This is a perspective deeply embedded in India's own philosophical traditions, which have historically emphasized the importance of dharma, duty and moral order, over mere material accumulation. The last element to consider is that major decisions like this rarely happen in isolation from internal politics. Domestic pressures ranging from public opinion to electoral dynamics can accelerate the breakdown of international relationships. If the population perceives a foreign partner as exploitative or disrespectful, political leaders may feel compelled to act decisively, even at great cost. This interplay between internal and external factors is what makes international relations so complex. The decision to end trade with America might reflect not only the state of the bilateral relationship, but also the broader narrative that India's leaders wish to present to their own people. And in a democracy, that narrative is often as powerful as the reality itself. A nation's sovereignty is not merely a piece of political jargon, it is the bedrock of its very existence. It is the capacity to make decisions free from coercion, to chart a course based on one's own values and priorities. For an individual, sovereignty means being responsible for your own life rather than leaning on someone else to carry your burdens. For a nation, it is the same principle, only scaled up to the level of millions of lives. Dependence on another country for critical economic resources creates a hidden chain, one that can be tugged at will by the supplier. That is not just economics, it is power politics. History shows that those who control the supply lines often control the destinies of those dependent on them. In that context, dependence is not just a weakness, it is an invitation for control. The problem is that dependency rarely appears dangerous at first. When trade flows freely and prosperity seems to follow, it is easy to ignore the vulnerabilities embedded in the arrangement. People become accustomed to the convenience, the abundance, and the apparent stability that such relationships provide. But behind that surface comfort is an imbalance of leverage. If one nation controls vital goods, services, or technologies, it holds the ability to disrupt the other's society almost overnight. This is not hypothetical, it has happened countless times in history. Entire economies have been brought to their knees not by war, but by the sudden withdrawal of trade. When the public realizes the fragility of such a system, the call for self-reliance becomes deafening. India's leaders, conscious of these patterns, would naturally see economic dependence as a liability rather than a luxury. A nation of over 1 billion people cannot afford to be at the mercy of another power's political winds. Even subtle forms of economic coercion, threats of sanctions, tariff hikes, or selective embargoes, can ripple through an economy this vast. The calculus becomes one of risk management. How much control over our destiny are we willing to place in foreign hands? This is not simply paranoia. It is the recognition that national security is not just defended at the border, it is defended in the marketplace. And if a trading partner can dictate terms that undercut your ability to govern freely, sovereignty is already compromised. The challenge lies in balancing openness with resilience. International trade can be a tremendous force for growth, innovation, and mutual understanding. But when that openness becomes dependency, the balance tips towards vulnerability. The temptation for short-term gain can blind both leaders and citizens to the long-term costs of losing economic independence. It is easy to trade away a small measure of sovereignty for the promise of cheaper goods or access to foreign markets. But every concession builds precedent, and over time, those precedents accumulate into a pattern. And once that pattern solidifies, reversing it becomes politically and economically painful. This is why nations that value sovereignty must guard against dependency long before it becomes an obvious threat. The metaphor that comes to mind is that of a tree with deep roots versus one in shallow soil. A tree in shallow soil may grow quickly if fed by external sources, but it is vulnerable to the first strong wind. The deeply rooted tree, by contrast, draws its strength from within, making it more resilient in the face of storms. Economic sovereignty works in much the same way. Nations that cultivate self-reliance, even at the cost of slower growth, tend to weather global disruptions better than those built on dependency. And just as a gardener knows the danger of overwatering from an external source, a wise leader understands the perils of excessive foreign reliance. The goal is not isolation, it is rooted strength. Critics often point out that complete independence in a globalized world is unrealistic. And they are right. Nations inevitably rely on others for certain resources, markets, or technologies. But the issue is not absolute independence. It is strategic independence. The distinction is crucial. Strategic independence means ensuring that no single foreign power has enough control over your critical systems to dictate your policy decisions. This requires a careful diversification of trade partners, the development of domestic industries, and the cultivation of alternative supply chains. These are not merely economic strategies they are acts of political self-defense. In this light, ending trade with a dominant partner can be seen as a strategic maneuver rather than reckless isolationism. For India, this principle resonates deeply with its historical journey. Having endured centuries of colonial exploitation, the memory of external control is not just a historical footnote, it is woven into the national consciousness. The lessons learned from that period emphasize the importance of controlling one's own resources, industries, and decision-making processes. When you have been ruled by outsiders who extracted your wealth and dictated your economic destiny, the idea of allowing another nation to hold similar influence becomes intolerable. Sovereignty is not just an abstract principle for India, it is a hard-earned safeguard, and safeguarding it sometimes means making difficult, unpopular, or even costly decisions in the short term. Furthermore, sovereignty entails responsibility. It is not enough to declare independence from external control. A nation must also take ownership of the consequences. This means being prepared to solve its own problems, manage its own crises, and bear the weight of its own failures. In the same way that an adult cannot truly be free if they rely on their parents to solve every problem, a nation cannot be sovereign if it expects others to absorb the cost of its mismanagement. Responsibility is the price of freedom, and it is non-negotiable. India's leaders, in ending a dependent trade relationship, may be asserting not just their freedom to choose, but also their willingness to carry the burdens that come with that choice. Economic independence also changes the psychological posture of a nation. A country that knows it can survive without bending to the will of another stands taller in diplomatic negotiations. It is not negotiating from a place of fear, but from a place of strength. This changes everything, from how it sets foreign policy to how it interacts with allies and competitors alike. The difference between dependence and independence is the difference between asking, "What will they allow us to do?" and saying, "Here is what we will do." That shift in language reflects a profound shift in mindset, and in geopolitics, mindset often precedes reality. When viewed through this lens, sovereignty is not a static possession, but a living, dynamic process. It has to be defended, renewed, and adapted as circumstances change. External pressures will always test its limits, and internal complacency will always threaten to erode it from within. That is why actions like ending a trade relationship with a dominant partner are not just reactive. They are preventative. They are designed to preserve the conditions under which sovereignty can continue to exist. In the absence of such vigilance, dependency creeps back in quietly, and by the time it is noticed, the chains are already too strong to break without immense cost. Economic profit is an intoxicating force, but it is not the sole measure of a nation's health. A culture is not simply an accessory to be worn or discarded depending on the trade balance. It is the underlying structure that gives a people their identity, purpose, and direction. When trade agreements begin to interfere with that cultural foundation, the stakes rise beyond currency and commodities. You can rebuild an economy faster than you can rebuild a cultural soul once it has been eroded. Nations are more than GDP figures, they are living narratives. A country without its own cultural backbone is like a body without a spine. It cannot stand upright. To defend culture, sometimes you have to push back against arrangements that promise wealth but demand conformity to values that are alien to your heritage. The danger is that cultural erosion often happens subtly, almost invisibly, through the slow seepage of foreign influence embedded in trade. Every product, every brand, every imported standard carries with it assumptions, aesthetics, and moral underpinnings. Over time, these influences can begin to alter not just consumer habits, but the very ways in which people think and behave. A society that once grounded itself in its own traditions may find those traditions becoming quaint, even obsolete, in the face of imported ideals. This is not always deliberate. It is simply the natural result of cultural contact without balance. But when the inflow becomes so strong that the local culture is overshadowed, the economic benefits begin to look more like a Trojan horse than a gift. India, with its vast and diverse heritage, is especially sensitive to this kind of cultural shift. Its philosophical systems, spiritual traditions, and social structures have evolved over thousands of years. They are not simply artifacts of the past. They are living systems that shape how communities interact and how meaning is found in everyday life. When trade relationships begin to pressure the adoption of norms that clash with these traditions, resistance becomes more than economic. It becomes existential. A culture that has survived centuries of invasion, colonization, and modernization does not simply roll over in the face of economic opportunity. Instead, it weighs that opportunity against the risk of losing something irreplaceable. Consider how values are transmitted. They are not passed down only through explicit teaching. They are embedded in the rituals, products, and services that make up daily life. If those rituals are replaced wholesale with imported ones, the values shift accordingly. A country that consumes only what others produce begins to live according to the logic of others. This is not isolationist paranoia. It is an observable sociological pattern. Cultural identity is strengthened by participation in its own economy, by producing goods and services that reflect its own world view. When trade relationships disrupt this process, the integrity of the culture becomes compromised, and once that integrity is weakened, it is difficult to restore without significant social upheaval. This is why leaders must sometimes make decisions that appear irrational in purely economic terms. Cutting ties with a lucrative trading partner may cost billions in lost revenue, but it may also protect the symbolic and practical foundations of the nation's identity. That is not an act of fear, it is an act of stewardship. You do not measure the health of a culture solely by the number of skyscrapers it can build, but by the resilience of its traditions in the face of global homogenization. Economic growth that comes at the expense of cultural erosion is a form of self-cannibalization, feeding on the very thing that gives you meaning. Without meaning, wealth itself becomes hollow. In psychological terms, culture functions like the operating system of a society. You can install new programs, new technologies, new industries, but if the operating system itself becomes corrupted, the entire system falters. Trade relationships, when not carefully managed, can act as updates to that operating system. Some updates improve performance, but others rewrite the code in ways that fundamentally change the system's behavior. If those changes come from a partner whose values are misaligned, the result is a cultural drift towards a way of life that may not serve the people well. For India, whose operating system is deeply rooted in its spiritual and philosophical traditions, the risk of incompatible updates is taken seriously. The modern world often treats culture as something ornamental, as though it can be placed in a museum for safekeeping while the economy moves on without it. But culture is not a static artifact. It is a living, breathing force that shapes every interaction. It determines how people treat one another, how they solve problems, and what they aspire to achieve. If you erode culture, you erode the invisible infrastructure that makes society function. And because this infrastructure is intangible, it is often undervalued until it is already collapsing. That is why defending it requires foresight, not just reaction. The influence of global superpowers like America is not purely economic, it is cultural. Every trade agreement carries with it an implicit exchange of values. This is not inherently negative. Cross-cultural exchange can enrich both sides. But enrichment is different from replacement. The problem arises when one culture dominates the other so thoroughly that the smaller culture becomes a reflection of the larger, losing its unique voice. India's decision to step away from a trade relationship can thus be understood as an attempt to preserve its voice in the global choir. Without that voice, it risks becoming another echo in the global marketplace, indistinguishable from the rest. The preservation of cultural identity is not a romantic luxury, it is a practical necessity. A people who lose their cultural grounding become more susceptible to manipulation, both from within and without. When the values that once anchored them are replaced by imported ideals, their sense of self becomes fragmented. Fragmentation leads to instability, and instability is fertile ground for exploitation. This is as true for nations as it is for individuals. Protecting culture through economic decisions is therefore not backward-looking, it is forward-looking, aimed at ensuring long-term stability and self-determination. Trade relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect. Respect in this context means acknowledging and honoring the other's way of life, rather than subtly or overtly trying to override it. If one partner uses economic leverage to push cultural change, the relationship ceases to be equitable. For a country like India, such a dynamic is intolerable, not only because it undermines sovereignty, but because it endangers the continuity of a heritage that has outlasted countless empires. That heritage is not merely a historical artifact, it is the foundation upon which future generations will build their lives. Chaos is not merely the absence of order, it is the raw, unshaped potential that emerges when a familiar structure is broken. When a nation chooses to end a significant trade relationship, it deliberately dismantles part of the framework that has supported its economy. That is an invitation for chaos to enter. Markets respond unpredictably, industries face disruption, and ordinary citizens feel the strain in their daily lives. The question then becomes, why would any rational leadership willingly walk into that uncertainty? The answer lies in the recognition that some forms of chaos are worth enduring if they protect a deeper order. Temporary instability may be the price for preserving values that are not negotiable. To stand firm in the face of such chaos requires not recklessness, but courage anchored in conviction. Courage in this context is not bravado. It is the willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term integrity. Nations, like individuals, are often tempted to compromise their principles when confronted with the fear of immediate loss. It is easy to stay in a flawed relationship, whether personal or economic, simply because leaving feels too disruptive. But that choice often trades future freedom for present comfort. India's decision to withstand the chaos of breaking with America suggests a prioritization of principle over convenience. Such courage does not emerge spontaneously. It is cultivated over decades through the repeated assertion of sovereignty and self-respect. Without this cultivated strength, the allure of avoiding hardship would almost certainly prevail, even when it means living under quiet subjugation. There is a paradox here. To maintain order, sometimes you must risk disorder. People think of order as stability, but real order is not merely the absence of trouble. It is the alignment of a system with its core values and truths. If the existing order has been compromised, preserving it is actually a form of decay. In such cases, shaking the system may be the only way to restore its integrity. Ending a major trade relationship can be seen as such a shake, a controlled detonation aimed at removing the rot while preserving the foundation. It is a gamble, certainly, but one informed by the belief that chaos can be navigated if you have a clear compass. Without that compass, chaos consumes. With it, chaos can renew. Navigating chaos requires both vision and discipline. Vision without discipline produces idealists who cannot execute, and discipline without vision produces functionaries who maintain broken systems. In the realm of national policy, both must coexist. The vision here would be a future where India stands economically and culturally independent, charting its own course without undue external pressure. The discipline is the hard work of managing the fallout, stabilizing markets, finding new trade partners, and ensuring that citizens remain supported through the transition. This combination of vision and discipline transforms chaos from a threat into an opportunity. It becomes the raw material from which a more resilient order can be forged. Fear is the primary force that prevents nations from making such moves. Fear of economic downturn, fear of political backlash, fear of international isolation. These are potent deterrents. Yet fear, if allowed to dictate policy, produces timidity, and timidity eventually erodes the very sovereignty it seeks to protect. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means proceeding in spite of it. Leaders who choose the path of controlled chaos must therefore accept fear as a constant companion. They must learn to use it as a signal for caution, not as a justification for paralysis. The difference between collapse and renewal often lies in whether fear is allowed to dominate the decision-making process. For a nation, enduring chaos is not simply about survival. It is about transformation. Just as the human psyche grows stronger when it confronts and integrates adversity, a nation can emerge from economic disruption with greater adaptability and resourcefulness. This transformation is rarely linear or predictable. It often involves setbacks, missteps, and moments of doubt. But if guided by a coherent strategy and a commitment to core values, the process strengthens the national fabric. The willingness to endure hardship becomes a form of inoculation against future vulnerabilities. Each successful navigation of chaos builds the confidence to face the next storm without surrendering principle for security. The metaphor of walking into a storm is apt. From a distance, the storm is terrifying. Wind howls, skies darken, and the air is filled with uncertainty. But those who prepare, who carry the right tools and knowledge, can make their way through it. The experience of passing through the storm changes them. They learn what they are capable of and what is truly essential for survival. For India, the storm of economic disruption could strip away certain dependencies and illusions, leaving behind a leaner, more self-reliant system. This process is neither comfortable nor glamorous, but it is deeply formative. It produces the kind of resilience that no theoretical plan can substitute for. Another aspect often overlooked is the psychological effect on the international stage. When a nation willingly walks into chaos for the sake of principle, it sends a message to allies and adversaries alike. It declares that its decisions cannot be bought or coerced with economic incentives alone. This alters the terms of future negotiations, making it clear that concessions will not be extracted through fear of instability. Such a stance increases a nation's bargaining power, because it shows a capacity to absorb pain without capitulation. In a world where power often flows towards those most willing to endure hardship, this is a significant advantage. Enduring chaos also requires an internal unity of purpose. A fragmented society will fracture further under pressure, turning the chaos into internal conflict rather than external resilience. Leaders must therefore articulate a compelling narrative that connects the short-term sacrifice to the long-term vision. This narrative must resonate with the public's sense of identity and shared destiny, not merely with its pocketbook. If people believe they are suffering for a cause greater than themselves, they can endure far more than they imagined. This is why the moral dimension of economic policy is as important as the technical dimension. Without moral conviction, Chaos breaks a society. With it, chaos can bind it closer together. In the end, the courage to face chaos for the sake of deeper order is a rare quality, both in individuals and in nations. It demands clarity about what is worth protecting, discipline to manage the fallout, and resilience to withstand the turbulence without losing sight of the destination. It is not a decision that can be made lightly, nor one that can be justified purely in material terms. The chaos is real, the cost is tangible, but so too is the potential for renewal. Nations that master this balance do not just survive, they redefine themselves in the process. The choice is never easy, but it is always revealing.